theological disciplines broadly covers what you will study if you study theology at a seminary or at a university. And briefly, the four major umbrella areas or umbrella terms of theology is exegesis, it's systematic theology, it is church history, and also practical theology. Now, if we look first at the term exegesis. Exegesis refers to the scientific examination of biblical texts using historical and literary methods. So, if you perform exegesis of the Old Testament text, or you perform exegesis of the New Testament text, you'll use similar methods, and they are historical and philological in nature. In other words, historical, that means you look at when these books were composed, they were written by who, what was the historical context, and philology, that's a study of language in oral or for us written sources. Here you use tools like literary criticism, also history, and also linguistics, the meaning of words and how the meaning of words developed over time, and also how to translate it or to interpret their meaning properly. So exegesis, this is a scientific examination of texts, and here you can ask specific questions. For example, if you look at the psalm, you can say, what is the structure of a psalm? Or maybe if you study or perform exegesis on the New Testament, you can ask the question, what is a parable? Yeah, you will look also at other genres. For example, an exhortation, or is this law, or is this an ethical admonition? So this is what exegesis looks at. It tries to get at the most accurate meaning of a text. And also, exegesis also asks, what type of theology is represented in this particular book? For example, the book of Deuteronomy has a particular theology. It has its own unique character in terms of its understanding of God. For example, that God has revealed himself through prophets, and the prophets has repeatedly warned the people to come back to the covenant, and if people obey, then God will bless them, and if they continue to be disobedient, then God will bring punishment. And there are quite several books in the Old Testament that follow this, what is known as a Deuteronomist way of thinking. The scheme of theology that's also built into the text. Also, if you look at the New Testament, what theology does the Gospel of Mark contain? What does it teach about Jesus? Because there it's a bit different to the theology that we will encounter in the Gospel of John. Also, the Apostle Paul, in his own writings, will have a specific brand or approach to theology. So that is what exegesis does, the scientific examination of the text, to understand the meaning of the text, and also the theology of that particular book or individual author that wrote books of the Bible. And the second theological discipline is systematic theology. And systematic theology is divided into dogmatics and ethics. Now remember, this video series concerns dogmatics. In other words, matter of doctrine. What's it teaching about the Trinity, of salvation, of the sacraments, etc. That is dogmatics. Another branch of systematic theology is ethics. And so if you want to contrast the two, for example, if you want to ask a dogmatic question is, how is the Holy Spirit active in the divine service? You can also ask other dogmatic questions. What are the sacraments? What do they do? Or, what is the first resurrection? That is a dogmatic question. And then you get ethical questions. For example, is there such a thing as justified war? And also ethical issues around marriage and euthanasia. These are ethical questions. So that is systematic theology, which has two subdivisions, dogmatics and ethics. And now the next theological discipline is church history. And church history is a scientific approach. In other words, it investigates the historical development of Christianity. So here, the development of Christian churches are looked at, and also theological concepts that has developed and themselves has become historical in a sense. For example, like the early church creeds and councils that formulated those creeds. So it's a scientific examination. It looks at the historical evidence for the development of the Christian church. This is firstly the history of the early church. So that's the early Christians, the time of the church fathers, the time of the early church councils, etc. And also Christianity existing in the Roman Empire. Then there's the church history of the medieval period. That's from roughly 500 to 1500. This is the time period of the Crusades, the development of the various orders like the Franciscans, also scholasticism, which was mentioned in the previous video. And then there's a church history of the Reformation. This is a time of people like Martin Luther and John Calvin, etc. And there is also the church history of the modern age. This is the time period of the revival movements. And also the development of the new apostolic church will fall under this time period, the church history of the modern age. So church history in its own right is a theological discipline. Now the fourth theological discipline is practical theology. And practical theology concerns itself with the application of faith. So issues that are looked at or studied here is, for example, what's the intersection between or interconnection between faith and society? Also, diaconia, in other words, social work. What is our social responsibility as a church? How do we reach out to the needy, to help those who are poor, etc.? There's also pastoral care. Pastoral care is about counseling. How do you give counseling to people who are in need? For example, death counseling or grief counseling. What about marriage counseling? What about HIV and AIDS counseling in the South African or African context, etc.? So that is pastoral care. In other words, giving actual help and assistance and counseling to people who need it. There's also religious instruction. In other words, Sunday school. How do you formulate Sunday school teaching materials? How do you teach Sunday school and biblical topics to children? That's also an aspect of practical theology. Then, of course, also there's homiletics. And homiletics looks at how do you prepare sermons? How do you deliver sermons to be effective? So these together form the main branches of theological disciplines. And just to summarize again, first there's exegesis. And exegesis is the scientific examination of biblical texts using historical and literary methods. Then there's systematic theology. That is subdivided into dogmatics and ethics, and it endeavors to think through Christian faith and over its matters of doctrine, that is dogmatics, and also to reflect upon Christian actions, that is ethics. Then church history, that incorporates the scientific portrayal of the history of Christianity, that's the Christian churches, and even the concepts of theology and theological development that happened through the ages. And lastly, it's practical theology. It has to do with application of faith. Things like doing counseling, giving Sunday school or religious instruction, social work, reaching out to the community, and also preaching, how to preach, which is also specifically known as a branch of homiletics. Now, if you look at our catechism, if you read it, most of what's in the catechism is what we would call dogmatics. So in other words, it will fall under the umbrella of systematic theology. Because most of the material in the catechism relates to dogmatics. For example, the doctrine of God, the doctrine of the future, the doctrine of the church, etc. But also in the catechism, we find a little bit of practical theology in terms of, because the divine services are mentioned, acts of blessing, etc. And there's also a bit of ethics in here, because it speaks about marriage and family, issues that relate to ethics, how to live as a Christian. And there's also a bit of church history in here, because there's a specific chapter devoted to the development of the Christian church. But predominantly in our catechism, we find dogmatics. In other words, doctrinal issues that are explained to us. What we do not find in the catechism is exegesis. Exegesis, that's a scientific interpretation of biblical texts. So the next time you read your catechism, you can know what you're reading here. Most of the time you'll encounter dogmatics. In other words, how do we understand Christian concepts? How do we understand the doctrine of the Trinity, of the sacraments, etc.? So those are our theological disciplines. And in our next video, we will look at exegesis.